Welcome to Yahoo Finance. I'm Kristen Myers, and this is 2020, A Time for Change. Well, like it or not, when it comes to change, politicians are often on the front lines and in the crosshairs. That's certainly true right now as we see Congress proposing legislation to reform law enforcement, and mayors across the country are painting Black Lives Matter murals on their streets. We'll be talking to politicians at all levels of government today. And as always, I'm joined by Seville Marcellus and Jen Rogers for today's conversation. So Jen, I want to start today's conversation with you. You recently sat down with DC Mayor Muriel Bowser. How does she view her place in this political movement for racial justice right now?
Well, I think she is front and center. And as you were talking about the Black Lives Matter mural, who did it first? Washington, D.C. did it. I talked with her about the mural, but I also talked with her about a lot of the challenges that we are facing right now. And what really struck me is she brought up nuance more than once, how we need to really have an evolved process around many of the conversations that we're having. Specifically, and this is what I want to start with, is we talked about the debate over policing and defunding the police. She has actually called for an increase in her most recent budget for the police force. And I asked her how that squares with all the calls out there to actually defund police.
So I think, first of all, we have to be realistic with people. You don't change institutions that are hundreds of years old overnight. And you can take money from them, but you also don't change the expectations of citizens. I mean, I haven't heard anybody tell the citizens to stop calling 911. So we have to change, not just as the government, we have to change as a community. Who do you expect to respond when you have a need for government service? And I think that's a challenge that we all can take, and I'm certainly looking at that in our government, but it doesn't change overnight.
So let's talk about the Black Lives Matter mural that you orchestrated. It really struck a chord across the country, people seeing it as the right sign in the right place at the right time. What do you think now about the fact that it's been replicated around the world? I mean, just look at New York City, which is encouraging, but then there's also all these stories of it becoming a flashpoint, smaller towns fighting over whether to even allow them at all.
Well, I think for us in the city, it was a response to a White House that was encroaching on our city, on our autonomy, federal forces on DC streets, peaceful protesters attacked by their government. And we had the opportunity to fight back, not just for us in Washington, but to this encroachment on our values. And this mural was perfect in its beauty and its symbolism, and our ability to get it done overnight in response to what we saw in American streets.
And it's so, the size of it is.
I know, it's huge.
It was huge. It's huge. Obviously, caught the president's attention as well. Not exactly a fan of the mural. He has tweeted about you that you're incompetent, that you're always looking for a handout. How do you deal with the obvious racism from the president and also his sexism towards you?
Well, we've seen the way he behaves and acts, and that he's challenged by women who speak up and stand up to him. I don't feel personally offended by anything that he says. I'm more concerned about what he does and what he's doing to our country in this pandemic response. How he shortchanged Washington, D.C. and COVID funding, and his seeming ignorance of what the District of Columbia is, and that we pay our own way. We are actually a donor jurisdiction. We give more to the federal government than we get back. And that I am always going to make sure that we're made whole. And so that is why the money that we were shorted in the CARES Act, we're urging the Senate to act on the House HEROES Act that makes the district whole.
So If these were normal times and we could all travel, like I could see families going to DC and wanting to go see the mural, it being almost like a tourist destination, a new place to go. Because now when you go to DC, you go to the mall and you're going to the monuments. Those monuments have also become discussions as well as we are rethinking much of our history. There have been calls to reimagine the Jefferson Memorial, even from his family. Do you think that that's something that needs to happen? Could you see, us making changes to memorials there?
I think that there is going to be a huge discussion of monuments and memorials in our country. I think that all of the rethinking of the Confederate memorials in particular is hugely important. I am created a task force in DC to look at all of those historical references in the district. We had one Confederate memorial, and that's it. But we have other controversial figures, including presidents of the United States, that are taking up a lot of attention. The one for sure that we will likely move on first is Woodrow Wilson in a school that's named for Woodrow Wilson. But I think it's important to have a dispassionate discussion about this. I think all the decisions that are made are kind of when, the feeling is so red hot, we might not be best served by. So how do we deal with this thing? You're talking to a history buff. How do we deal with the history of our country, not glorifying people who are traitors to our nation, not glorifying slaveholders, but recognizing that this is American history. So what is the best way to deal with it?
I was really struck. She was just talking there about trying to be dispassionate, but really how passionate she is about all of these issues. And Kristen, now that she's front and center on the national scene here, we spoke before I did the interview, and you were interested in her political ambitions. And I want to let you know, I did ask her. She says she has the best job right now, and she is not being vetted by the Biden campaign for a VP slot. Also on the topic of statehood for Washington, D.C., if she wanted to be the governor or senator, she teased maybe that could be her daughter in the future, if we could get them to be the 51st state.
Well, we'll have to see. I mean, DC statehood is pretty unlikely right now, and Mayor Bowser actually saying that if DC actually could gain statehood, that it would be Black history. All right, well, coming up, we hear from Housing and Urban Development Secretary Dr. Ben Carson. That's next.
Welcome back to 2020, A Time for Change. I'm Sabila Marcellus. U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Ben Carson, a neurosurgeon, is the only member of President Trump's cabinet who is Black. I spoke to him about his conversations with President Trump about race. Here's what he had to say about who is responsible for the current state of race relations in America.
Really, what we as a nation have to do when it comes to the racial issues is recognize that we all have a responsibility. It's not all on the president. We all have a sphere of influence, and we decide what happens in that sphere of influence, how we are going to react, how we are going to treat other people, how are we going to treat our fellow man. We get to decide that. The president doesn't decide that.
And what would you like to hear from President Trump directly as an African-American man?
Well, I've talked to him, and, he has acknowledged that there are some problems in law enforcement, no question about that, just like there are problems with doctors, there are problems with firemen. There are even problems with journalists. They're everywhere. We don't characterize the entire profession on the basis of what a few people do. And it's totally unfair for us to be doing that with the police. At the same time, the president has put forth a number of policies which I think are very, very useful in terms of justice reform. And we should be talking about those. And we should be laying blame where it should be, and that is on Congress for not really taking this up in a serious way.
Well, let's talk about the economic impact of Confederate symbols. So according to the Economic Policy Institute, Black workers earn 21% less than their white counterparts. But when they live in an area where there are Confederate street signs named after Confederate generals, then they face an additional 3% wage penalty. So President Trump has criticized NASCAR for banning the Confederate flag. Do you agree with him on that?
Well, I think we need to stand back and recognize that we already have mechanisms in place, for dealing with statues and symbols. There are legal mechanisms whereby people can put these things on the ballot, they can vote, and if they decide that this is something that they don't like, that's offensive to them, it can be taken down. But to simply go about as marauders and the person with the biggest stick gets to rule, that's not very helpful for anybody. As far as the Confederate flag is concerned, obviously I don't particularly like seeing that. If people want to fly that on their private property, they're welcome to do that. But if it's in a public place, again, we have mechanisms for dealing with that, just like they did in South Carolina. And that's what we should do. But it would also be, I think, instructional to educate people about the Confederate flag, the people who created the Confederate flag, and what they said it represented. And I think a lot of people who fly it would probably take it down on their own if they knew that.
You said that you were actually trying to get President Trump in an interview to reconsider his stance when it comes to NFL players kneeling during the national anthem. Have you been successful in that? Because President Trump has criticized the NFL for reversing their stance.
Well, he hasn't talked a lot about it, so that's progress. We just have to keep moving in the right direction. But at the same time, as you noted, I said the NFL players assume that everybody knows why they're kneeling, that they're trying to bring attention to police brutality. That's not true. Everybody doesn't know that. And a lot of people think that they're being disrespectful to the flag, disrespectful to, law enforcement, disrespectful to the military. And, if they're going to do something, they really need to make sure that people fully understand it. Just because they think somebody understands it doesn't mean that people understand it. And they should, I take some comfort in the fact that a lot of attention has been brought to that issue now.
Really struck me in this interview with Secretary Carson is that he emphasized everybody's responsibility in improving race relations in America, specifically education. So when it comes to the Confederate flag, educating people who want to fly the flag, basically why it was created in the first place, the intentions of those people. And then secondly, when it comes to NFL players kneeling during the national anthem, he said that, yes, they can do that, but they also need to make sure that people understand why they're doing it so they don't think that they're protesting law enforcement overall or the military overall.
Yeah, I'm not surprised to hear some of the comments from, Dr. Ben Carson, although I think, honestly, as a Black woman, it's a little bit disheartening to hear someone with such a high level in the administration not taking a more forceful stand against the president and some of the administration and the policies that we're seeing being brought forth. Just last month, the president decided to enact an executive order on police reform, and it really just focused on, for example, training without making more forceful regulations around banning chokeholds or any kind of training to make sure that Black folks are not being disproportionately, one, arrested by police and law enforcement, and two, killed by law enforcement. So, I don't know how anyone else kind of feels about it hearing that interview. I personally a little bit disappointed in some of Ben Carson's comments that he made, and also frankly just the lack of accountability that we're hearing out of this administration, particularly on this matter, especially tossing journalists under the bus. I didn't know we were going to be taken to task by Dr. Carson today, but throwing everyone under the bus and really a lack of accountability that seems to be going on there. Jen, if you're talking, you're muted right now.
Thank you. To that point, I mean, the case he seems to be making is sort of the bad apples case. Like there's some bad journalists out there as well. And the conversation seems to have moved to a more systemic issue, what we're doing about this, not just as there's good people and bad people and people that maybe don't know what they're doing, but overall these bigger issues. And I think that the conversation has moved that way. And I wasn't really hearing that from Dr. Carson. I think that the conversation should be all over the monuments, just from my conversation with Mayor Bowser. I mean, it is both of them in some way. I mean, Mayor Bowser, she wants to be methodical about it as well. I think she's even saying like, let's, you don't want to do this when you're red hot. I think they come at it from different places, but there are, I can hear some of the similarities just about a little bit to slow down. Do you think that's fair in that conversation at all? I mean, that she's studying it and going about it, and he looks to be saying, let's go to the ballot box over this.
Yeah, so they are definitely taking two different approaches. So what you see with Mayor Bowser is that she had that Black Lives Matter basically painted on the streets of Washington, D.C., but she was doing this at the time where tensions were really heightened. There were peaceful protesters on the streets not too far from the White House. So she was really making a bold statement right when the entire nation was on edge and everybody was really paying attention to this. And it seems like we were going to hit a crisis. Now, it seems like it has de-escalated in terms of the protests, not as many people protesting out on the streets across the country. But what she's doing now is a more measured approach in the sense that she says she's going to put together a task force to consider what they're going to do about names on buildings. For example, Woodrow Wilson and his name being on, a school, but he's also a president of the United States. What do you do about that? When it comes to Dr. Ben Carson, Secretary Carson, he's obviously working for President Trump. So he is a mouthpiece. He's also part of the administration. So he has a more fine line to walk, but he clearly understands, and he definitely does not support people flying the Confederate flag. He definitely supports Black Lives Matter, but it's just a different approach given they both have different roles.
Yeah, Sabeel, I think, kind of what you're talking about here is there is a difference between, and this is not to imply that Mayor Bowser's movements are that, but there are clear statements that can be sort of Band-Aid issues. And then there's also clearly a need. And I think, we're hearing that being said, mayors are saying it, congressmen are saying it, senators are saying it, that there is a need in order to tackle systemic racism, in order to tackle some of the issues that the three of us have been chatting about for several weeks now. There is a need for structural change. There is a need for legislative change to tackle some of these systemic issues. One of them, of course, as you were discussing, Jen, with the mayor, being defunding the police. People saying perhaps we need to reroute funds to tackle policing in a more holistic way. In New Jersey, they actually experienced, in Camden, New Jersey, experienced quite a bit of success with doing that. They actually decided to rebuild the whole policing system there and have been having a lot of success when it comes to policing, community policing there. Of course, they didn't get rid of their police force entirely. I don't think anyone supports that. We absolutely need someone on the other end if anyone calls 911. But again, I think that what we're seeing here and what I'm interested in and what I'm excited to see going forward, and our next guest will be able to chat about this some more as well, is that tackling those systemic and structural issues that we're seeing.
Absolutely. We're going to keep the conversation going, Jen and Kristen. And coming up, we're going to talk about how a new rule for payday lenders may trap Black Americans in a vicious debt cycle with high interest rates. Congressman Gregory Meeks, a senior member of the House Financial Services Committee, joins us to talk about this next.
Back to 2020, a time for change. Well, as coronavirus cases continue to spike and even more job layoffs loom, Americans were dealt another blow as a new rule erased measures aimed at protecting consumers from a vicious debt cycle. For this and much more, we are joined now by senior member of the House Financial Services Committee, Congressman Gregory Meeks from New York. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good being with you.
So I want to start on that latest rule. And I actually think that with all the coronavirus news that we've been hearing, that not too many people actually know about it. So it actually has to do with payday lenders. So under this revised rule, payday lenders don't have to check that borrowers can repay their loan, which some critics are saying might trap folks in a debt cycle with interest rates as high as 400%. So I'm wondering if you can highlight some of the concerns for us, especially for the Black community specifically. And we have some charts going here that's going to show how Black folks pay more in fees for banking and financial services. So I'm wondering, you know, if you can highlight some of those concerns specifically for the Black community, and if those concerns you have are growing now, especially with so many folks that are being squeezed because of the coronavirus pandemic.
Well, there's no question those fears are growing, and this action that's put forth by the quote unquote, and what we thought would be the Consumers Protection Bureau is just the opposite. I had a conversation with the chair of the CFPB, and I said to them what I'm going to say to you, that the Consumer Protection Bureau was put into place to protect consumers. And the only justification that she was giving me was to protect these payday lenders, that their payday lenders needed the business. It's backwards. So they're willing to sacrifice and continue to put African-American, Hispanic, and low-income individuals into debt that they will never get out of as a result of this coronavirus, and just because of the way the product is put forward, as opposed to protecting the consumer. They eradicated things that were put in place when Mr. Conroy was the head of the CFPB, and completely gone in the other direction. So I have huge concerns because this is the kind of debt that you almost never get out of, and it prevents individuals from having the opportunity to enjoy the American dream. In fact, given where we are in the moment right now, it's exactly the opposite of what folks have been demonstrating about when they're talking about disparities and others. That's what they're in the streets about. The disparity in reference to financial services and what's taking place with these payday lenders and the way that the CFPB is moving as opposed to where the direction we should be going in, and helping CDFIs and MDIs and small banks and credit unions banking to individuals that need these small dollar loans.
So I want to switch gears now to some legislation that you've got in the House, or, you know, that Congress is considering on stimulus. I mean, how much of an if is it in your mind that $600 unemployment boost won't necessarily be passed, and what are folks going to do without it?
Well, clearly, it's stuck over in the Senate with Mitch McConnell, and I'm starting to call him the Undertaker because the bills that we put over there, he keeps burying them. But what I think is going to, and I hope that takes place, because as we get to the end of the month and various forbearance with banks and others start, and people are having more difficulty in paying their rent and or their mortgage, that the Senate will be forced to look at the $600 unemployment, which helps individuals to pay their rent and their bills. Because what is happening, at the time when they were domestically opposed, if you remember, it was only states like New York and Illinois and Michigan that were suffering from the virus, and it seemed as though they were playing politics with that because those happened to be Democratic states. And in fact, they were talking about how states like Florida and Texas and Louisiana were flourishing. Now, just the opposite is happening. They are now under tremendous pressure, and the things that we were going under in New York are going under, those states are going under. And the cost to those states are happening. And people there won't be able to pay their rent. So I'm hoping that this will put pressure on Mitch McConnell and the Republicans in the Senate to make sure that now that they pass the HEROES Act so that we can help individuals. And these individuals we need to help. They're not Democrats, just Democrats. They're Democrats, they're Republicans, they're independents. They're American citizens that are going to need our help.
Oh, hey, Kristen, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I wish we had more time with you, Congressman. We're going to have to leave that there. Congressman Gregory Meeks. And that is our show for now. Thank you all for watching. Be sure to tune in this time next week as we continue these conversations.